There is a photograph I keep coming back to. It was taken in 1925 in the Brazilian interior. It shows a man standing at the edge of a clearing he was never supposed to reach. Percy Harrison Fawcett, Lieutenant Colonel, Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, a man trained to observe, record and report exactly what he saw. He walked into that forest. He never came back, and 3 governments spent the next decade making absolutely certain that nobody followed him. Subscribe right now and hit the bell, because what I found in those archives changes everything you think you know about the Amazon. I have been sitting on this investigation for 3 months. 3 months of cross-referencing expedition logs, colonial archives, Brazilian military records, and documents that were, and I want to be precise, not declassified, simply misfiled in places they should not be, accessible to anyone patient enough to look. What I found changed how I understand every map I have ever trusted, because Fawcett did not disappear. Not exactly. He arrived, he found what he went looking for, and whatever he was standing in front of in those final unrecorded days was considered significant enough that the silence around it has been actively maintained for 100 years. The question was never what happened to Fawcett. The question is what happened when he arrived. Fawcett was not a romantic, not a fantasist. Before he walked into the Mato Grosso in April 1925, he had already completed 7 grueling expeditions into South American interior territories, officially commissioned, methodically documented, accepted without controversy by the most credible geographical institution in the world. He had mapped rivers European cartography had never acknowledged. He had negotiated with indigenous nations that official colonial records described conveniently as uncontactable. He was not a man who saw things that weren't there. So when Fawcett began writing about what he called Z, the question is not whether he was confused, not whether he was delusional. The question is why a meticulous credentialed surveyor became in the final decade of his career increasingly insistent that somewhere in the unexplored Brazilian interior lay the physical remnants of a civilization of staggering antiquity and scale. He called it a city. Stone. Organized, old in a way that challenged the accepted sequence of human development in the Western Hemisphere. He wasn't guessing, he had sources. Among them, manuscript 512, held in the National Library of Rio de Janeiro, catalogued, requestable today. An 18th century Portuguese account from a Bandeirante expedition of 1753, describing a ruined city in the Bahian interior. Stone archways, inscriptions in an unidentified script, buildings of a scale inconsistent with any civilization the Portuguese believed had ever occupied that territory. The document exists, the catalogue entry exists. What does not exist is any serious institutional engagement with what it describes. Fawcett wrote to a colleague in 1920 that the academic establishment had no interest in revising what they have already decided. That is a remarkable thing for a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, to commit to paper. But Fawcett was not the beginning of this story, not even close. Francisco de Orellana becomes the first European to navigate the full Amazon. His chronicler, Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, records the entire journey. What Carvajal documents across thousands of kilometers of river is not a wilderness, it is a civilization. Cities stretching along the riverbanks for kilometers, populations in the hundreds of thousands, roads, organized agriculture at a scale he struggled to describe, towers of white stone visible from the water. The standard academic treatment is that he exaggerated. But why would a friar, a man whose credibility depended entirely on honest witness, fabricate cities that any subsequent expedition could verify? Why invent something checkable? Now the detail that stopped me completely. The indigenous communities Fawcett consulted, across multiple language groups separated by hundreds of kilometers with no means of coordinating, described the same thing Carvajal witnessed in 1541. Not ruins, not a lost city, a civilization that built with the forest, managed biological systems engineered into the soil functioning as infrastructure. Causeways, hydraulic systems, roads, and specific territories, every tradition marked as places outsiders were never meant to reach. Fawcett wrote in 1921 that his informants described cultivated growth of an unusual character, neither wild nor domestic in the sense we understand either term. That phrase sat untouched for over a century before anyone connected it to what soil scientists established as undisputed fact, that the terra preta soils throughout the Amazon are anthropogenic, not natural, created, still producing, still functioning 500 years after the civilization that built them disappeared. His last confirmed letter, May 29th, 1925. He wrote that if the expedition found what he expected, the whole story of the Americas would need to be rewritten. Then he walked into the forest, and the forest kept him. There is a moment in Rondon's declassified correspondence I have not been able to stop thinking about. Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, Brazilian army officer, the man who between 1890 and 1930 spent more cumulative time in the Brazilian interior than perhaps any other person with access to pen, paper, and institutional authority. And in 1913 he was accompanied into that interior by Theodore Roosevelt himself. The expedition produced an official published account. Fascinating, not least for what it does not say. Roosevelt mentions briefly that Rondon showed him certain features of the landscape he was not able to include in his published account at Rondon's specific request. Not subscribed yet? Do it now. What comes next never makes it into the official record. A former president of the United States notes in his own memoir that a Brazilian colonel asked him to omit specific observations, and Roosevelt honoured the request. What does a surveyor see that causes him to turn to an ex-president and say quietly, "Don't write that down"? The deeper I went into Rondon's correspondence, the more I noticed a pattern, not lies, deliberate incompleteness, reports filed to the Brazilian military, noted in indices, present in the cataloguing system, simply unavailable. Now the physical evidence nobody can argue away. Late 1990s. Deforestation in the Brazilian state of Acre reveals something hidden under the canopy for centuries. Geometric earthworks covering 13,000 square kilometres, circles, squares, octagons, some nearly 300 metres in diameter, 13,000 square kilometres, larger than Jamaica, carved with mathematical precision into the earth, then swallowed back by jungle so completely it took industrial deforestation to find it. Nobody argues these are natural. The debate is what they were for. The official answer, ceremonial enclosures, collapses the moment you map their locations against the terra preta concentrations. They sit at the precise boundaries of managed biological systems, not ceremonial sites, infrastructure markers at the edges of a designed landscape. A landmark peer-reviewed study, quietly absorbed without the reckoning it deserved, found that areas of the Amazon most densely populated before contact correspond directly to areas with statistically anomalous concentrations of domesticated tree species today. Brazil nut, cacao, acai, peach palm, producing reliably without being replanted. The distribution is not random. It follows the settlement patterns of a civilization that engineered its food supply into the forest, designed to keep producing long after the people who built it were gone. This is not a forest. It is a system still running 500 years later. Now the suppression pattern I kept finding in every direction. Fawcett disappeared April 1925. Within months, the Royal Geographical Society issued a statement categorizing his expedition as a private venture undertaken against institutional advice. If he found nothing, romantic who died for a fantasy. If he found something, why, already officially outside credible inquiry. Heads I win, tails you lose. Search expeditions launched for decades after, turned back by disease, terrain, and in at least 2 documented cases by explicit Brazilian military intervention. Both justifications legitimate on their face, practical effect identical every single time. The coordinates remained unvisited. Anna Roosevelt, granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt, unimpeachable credentials, groundbreaking work at Marijo Island in the late 1980s, large mound structures, dense habitation, ceramic traditions predating supposed contemporaries by centuries, published, peer-reviewed, cited, absorbed without consequence, no textbook revision, no public acknowledgement proportionate to what the findings meant, not suppression, something more effective, acknowledgement without integration, publication without consequence, the appearance of open inquiry producing none of its expected results. How does evidence accumulate across decades of peer-reviewed publication and produce so little revision in the foundational story? That is not rhetorical. It is the question and the evidence, laid side by side without the institutional framework that produced the silence, actually generates. And the answer points somewhere the official record has been carefully declining to go. There is a specific quality to what happens when researchers get close, every single time, without exception, across a century of attempts. Something stops them. Still watching and not subscribed, do it right now. What comes next is the part nobody talks about. In 1961, Brazil established FUNAI, controlling access to large portions of the Mato Grosso interior. Necessary, appropriate, I am not suggesting otherwise, but the territories under the most stringent access control correspond, with geographic precision, to the areas Fawcett identified as the most likely locations of pre-contact infrastructure. Not all protected territories, these specific ones. Brazilian archaeologists noted this quietly in footnotes. The phrase that recurs, access constraints, have limited systematic survey of the most promising areas, not the least promising, the most promising ones. One number I found buried in a 1987 Brazilian military survey, never cited in any mainstream publication. More than 100 people have died attempting to find what became of Fawcett since 1925. 100 people, voluntarily, across a century. What was he walking toward that made that level of human cost feel proportionate to the question? The oral traditions Fawcett gathered, across language groups with no contact with each other, described not just a civilization, they described why it disappeared. Not disease, not war, a deliberate withdrawal, a civilization that understood disruption was coming and made a specific decision about what to preserve. They built it into the earth. The terra preta still producing 5 centuries later was not an accident. It was intentional preservation, a biological archive designed to outlast whatever came next. The oral traditions describing cultivated growth of an unusual character, neither wild nor domestic, were not mythology. They were maintenance instructions for a system still running right now. Here is what concerns me most, not any single piece of evidence. Individual anomalies can always be explained away. What cannot be explained is the coordination of the silence. The Royal Geographical Society's statement within months of Fawcett's disappearance. The Roosevelt omission in a published memoir. The Rondon reports noted in indices and never located. The most promising coordinates sealed for 60 years. Each one has an explanation. Together they point at something the official record has been consistently declining to name. Fawcett's last words were precise. The whole story of the Americas will need to be rewritten. The forest is still there, the terra preta still producing, the geoglyphs still carved across 13,000 square kilometers. The oral tradition still held by communities that never left. The question is not what happened to Fawcett. The question is what he found when he arrived, and why the answer has been not destroyed, not classified, simply kept just far enough out of reach that nobody has confirmed it. The forest remembers. It has been remembering for 500 years, waiting for someone willing to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads. If this changed how you see the Amazon, subscribe, share it, and drop a comment below.